But what if the Gospels in the autographs, the originals, what if they didn't contain the titles? What if they were anonymous, which is Ehrman's complaint? Well, it's really no big deal. Let's look at the A's, authorship. Now, Ehrman goes on to say, he says, the Gospels are forgeries. He says, what I mean by that is they claim to be authored by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but nobody believes in the academic community that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John actually penned these. He goes on to say that when you look at the manuscripts, the original manuscripts of these Gospels did not contain the titles that we see on them today. The Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, Luke, and John. Okay. So what do we say about this? Well, first I would say that we really don't know if the originals had the titles because we don't have the originals, and we haven't had them for some time. So Ehrman really can't say that these titles weren't in the originals at some point because he's never seen them. But what if the Gospels in the autographs, the originals, what if they didn't contain the titles? What if they were anonymous, which is Ehrman's complaint? Well, it's really no big deal. Plutarch is the most prolific biographer in antiquity. He wrote probably 60 biographies. We really don't know how many exactly, but he wrote about 60, and we still have about 4 dozen of those that remain. So 48 is pretty good for the total number of biographies written on ancient figures. He's writing just after the turn of the 2nd century, so within a couple of decades of when the Gospels were written. You can purchase these. You can probably go online and see them. I've got my copies through the Harvard Loeb Classical Library series. You can read the Greek that was used on one side, the English on the other. And there's 10 volumes to fit in these 48 biographies. I did a search, and would you like to know how many times Plutarch's name appears in the 48 biographies we still have? It never does. Well, how do we know Plutarch wrote it then? Well, because the tradition had been passed along by ancient writers who knew who wrote these. For example, someone might quote Plutarch's, one of his biographies, and say, as Plutarch wrote in his life of Theseus, the legendary founder of Greece. So they'll quote Plutarch, or they will attribute these biographies to him. Well, is it possible that all of these people were mistaken and that Plutarch didn't write them? Sure, anything's possible. But historians don't look for possibilities, they look for probabilities. And when you have the unanimous testimony that Plutarch wrote these, well, historians just don't really question it at that point any longer, and we accept that Plutarch wrote those. Well, if that works for secular authors, why wouldn't it work for Christian authors? So then what traditions, you might say, let's just assume for a moment that Ehrman is right and that none of the Gospels bear the titles on it that we have in our New Testaments today. Well, there are traditions that have been passed along from early Christians, the early church fathers, that attribute the Gospels to the traditional authorship that we see in our New Testaments.